The world watched for 2 years as Josh Duggar was eventually apprehended by the law. Justice for his victims and retribution for his crimes were the main concerns of the trial, the decision, and the sentencing. Many thought that the Duggars' legal issues were over now that Josh was in jail. They were mistaken. The prequel was the criminal case. The primary event, which has the potential to completely destroy the Duggar financial empire, is just getting started. Justice was at the center of Josh's criminal trial. The upcoming conflict will be regarding money. A substantial sum of money. Although the family puts on a united front, legal experts think a civil war is simmering behind the scenes. The media, the prosecutors, and the online critics are hardly the biggest threats to Jim Bob Duggar's meticulously crafted world. It originates inside. His own children have filed a number of possible multi-million-dollar lawsuits, alleging financial exploitation and years of unpaid labor. Additionally, a growing number of legal, one of the inside watchers and pundits may be preparing to file. The lawsuit that could cost the Duggars everything is their next nightmare. Welcome to the Duggar Report and hello. We're here to analyze the news, the court cases, and the cultural effects of the most well-known fundamentalist family in America. For years, the narrative that we are delving into today has been seething beneath the surface. A story of finances, family, and faith that might blow up in court. Fear. Do me a favor if you're prepared to see past the news and comprehend the intricate legal system operating behind this family's back. If you haven't already, click the like button, subscribe, and enable notifications. Don't miss any of the updates on this evolving scenario. Your assistance enables this channel to carry out more in-depth research. Let's get started now. Reluctantly, Jill won the presidency. We must analyze the past in order to comprehend the future. The potential's blueprint. The Duggar family is already in legal disarray. Jill Dillard, the family's fourth child and first eloping daughter, wrote it rather than a prestigious law firm. It was more than just a side story that she struggled to get paid for her work on the family's reality shows. It serves as the fundamental model. Exhibit A is it. Jill was a popular favorite for years. These were more than simply personal milestones, including her courting of Derek Dillard, their marriage, and the birth of their first child. Ratings were involved. Gold for TLC. Jill was undoubtedly one of Counting On's main stars. She didn't play in the background. For a long time the show focused on her. However, she never received $1 for it, as she disclosed in her shocking memoir, Counting the Cost. Not a statement, not a payment, and not a residual. Jill describes a system that was offered to the kids as a kind of ministry in her book. According to allegations, Jim Bob, the patriarch and only signatory on the TLC contracts, presented the program as a means of sharing their families' values with the world. He asserted that the funds were reinvested in the family to support a large household that included food, housing, and other essentials for all. The children were conditioned not to question this since they were brought up in a system of complete obedience to their father. Inquiring about money was viewed as a symptom of a rebellious heart, avarice, and worldliness. When Jill and Derek were working as missionaries in Central America, the delusion started to fall apart. Their goal was to improve their personal financial situation. Assistance. However, they were also the faces of a popular television program that was bringing in millions of dollars for Jim Bob Duggar and TLC. They were so valuable to the series that the network even dispatched camera crews to film them in El Salvador. Nevertheless, no payment was ever made. According to Jill, the tipping point occurred in 2017 as she and Derek were getting ready to depart the program. They believed they should have received payment for the years of labor they had invested. This was not a handout request. Earned wages were demanded. For more than 2 years, Jill Dillard was the star of Counting On, appearing in hundreds of hours of television. Initial payment, $0. Jill claims that when they first tried to talk to Jim Bob about this, he responded with denial and incredulity. They just weren't supposed to be talking about money. Jim Bob allegedly made her an offer of a lump sum payment at that point. He gave it to him as a present, a kind act from a father to his daughter. It stated that the sum was $80,000. Although this would seem like a substantial amount of money to the normal person, commentators in the legal and entertainment sectors swiftly noted that it would be a very small portion of what a major reality TV star would make over a number of years. For the endless hours of filming, reshoots, interviews, and promotional work, it was less than minimum wage. Jill's experience establishes this as the first crucial element. It was due. By putting forth an offer, no matter how modest, Jim Bob was tacitly admitting that Jill's work had been worth money but had not been paid for it. It was more than a family ministry with volunteers from all walks of life. She was an important employee of a commercial enterprise. The second element, however, is considerably more crucial and ought to shiver the bones of the Duggar family's top brass. Derek and Jill thought the offer was unfair. They were aware that their input was more valuable. Thus, they took the one action that is just unimaginable in the world of the Duggars. They hired a lawyer. To sue her own father, Jill needed to hire a lawyer. Take a moment to process that. The negotiation was not amicable. The court case was hostile. She eventually secured a settlement through that method. She states that the whole amount, including the final payment, is $175,000. Although it was more than double the original offer, many analysts continue to hold the opinion that, given industry norms, it was much less than what she was actually due. However, the precise monetary amount is not the most significant lesson learned. Despite her reluctance, Jill's win in the process established two indisputable facts that now cast a dark cloud over the family. First, that the youngsters who contributed to the presentation have a right to monetary payment for their participation. Fundamentally, the family ministry debate was a house of cards that would crumble with even the smallest legal pressure. Second, and perhaps most importantly for today's study, Jim Bob Duggar refuses to pay his kids what they are entitled to, unless he is compelled by law to do otherwise. He gave a fair wage because he didn't perceive the inequity. In contrast to what is customary in the entertainment world, he did not intentionally establish trust with his children. He had all the money and all the power, and he only gave up a small amount of it in response to a real threat from the law. Jill and Derek weren't the only parties involved in her lawsuit. It set a precedent. A proof of concept was used. It displayed all of the other siblings who had grown up and young adulthood in front of TLC's cameras, demonstrating that they had also participated in a business deal. And it proved that the only language their father might understand in this subject is the language of a court complaint. This is the setting for the impending conflict. Jill opened the door with a kick. Who has the courage to go through it next is the question now. Unpacking the legal playbook, the cause of action. So, if another Duggar child or a group of them wanted to take this major step, what would their lawsuit truly? How does it look? It's not enough to just say, "Dad, you owe me." A solid basis and a clear cause of action are necessary for a legal case to be successful. Two strong legal ideas that would serve as the foundation of any litigation are highlighted by legal experts based on Jill's precedent and the case's facts. Child labor offenses and unjust enrichment. Let's dissect these. The first legal idea is unjust enrichment. Unfair enrichment comes first. In civil law, this idea is as straightforward as sounds. It states that unfairly enriching one individual at the expense of another is prohibited. The violation of a signed contract is not the issue. It's about fundamental justice. A plaintiff, in this case a Duggar child, would typically have to prove three elements in order to prevail in an unjust enrichment claim in a state like Arkansas. First, that the defendant benefited from them. As the leaders of the family business, Jim Bob Duggar and perhaps Michelle Duggar would be the defendants in this case. The benefit is immediately apparent. The children's whole life, including their courtships, marriages, pregnancies, joys, and personal hardships. The whole thing that TLC was purchasing was their labor as actors on film. There wouldn't have been a show without them. The second is that the defendant was aware of the benefit. Once more, clearing this bar is simple. Jim Bob knew more than that. The architect was him. He worked with TLC to negotiate the contracts. The filming was scheduled by him. He guided the involvement of his kids. He was aware of that. Millions of dollars were pouring into his bank accounts as a result of their presence and their stories. And third, that the defendants keeping the benefit without paying for it would be unfair or unequal. The case revolves around this. A lawyer for the children would claim that Jim Bob had a moral and legal obligation to compensate his children for their efforts on a commercial television show, to profit from their labor, and then say that it was all covered by giving them food and The entire definition of unfairness is shelter, which is a basic parental duty anyhow. Consider this in any other situation. You are employed by a family-run eatery. Your room in the family home and the food you eat are your payment according to your father, the owner. In the meantime, the restaurant is a huge success, and he is making a fortune for himself by purchasing commercial real estate with the money he makes. That would not be a fair arrangement in any of the nation's courts. Without the glitz of reality TV, the Duggar family's circumstances are essentially the same. The wealth was produced by the efforts of the children. Jim Bob kept that money. It is a classic example of unfair enrichment. Laws pertaining to child labor are the second legal notion. Let's now discuss child labor regulations, the second and possibly more explosive legal avenue. The situation becomes even more dangerous at this point since it shifts from a disagreement about justice to a charge of unlawful exploitation. The majority of states possess legislation aimed at safeguarding adolescents in the workplace. There are particularly strict regulations in the entertainment sector. The most well-known of them is California's Coogan Law, which bears the name of Jackie Coogan, a child performer from the 1920s whose parents wasted his multimillion-dollar fortune. According to the Coogan Law, a child actor must set aside a certain portion of their earnings, typically 15%, in a safeguarded trust fund that they can only access as a legal adult. This is typical workout in Hollywood. The industry is using it to stop exactly what is said to have occurred in the Duggar family. However, the majority of the Duggars' filming took place in Arkansas, which raises an important point. What is stated in Arkansas law? It becomes hazy at this point, and Jim Bob might have taken advantage of a legal limbo. Although child performers are protected under Arkansas law, these laws have typically been less extensive than those found in places like California or New York. The law has regulations and mandates items like employment permits. Regarding working hours, however, the rules pertaining to financial protection are less strict. A lawsuit, on the other hand, would scrutinize this murky region. Even if Arkansas legislation is weaker, the Duggar siblings' attorneys would contend that the goal of the law is to shield children from exploitation. They would contend that Jim Bob broke his fiduciary obligation as a father and guardian by keeping all of the money earned by his underage children, and not putting any down for their future. Consider it. When 19 Kids and Counting began, many of the youngsters who would eventually become the stars of Counting On were just that, children. Jessa was 16 years old. Joseph was 13, Joanna was 11, Jinger was 14, and Josiah was 12. They performed on a nationally televised television program for years as unpaid kid performers. They made money off of their childhoods. Plot points were created out of their most intimate encounters. A lawsuit might compel a court to address a significant issue. Is it legal for parents to profit from the life stories of their children and retain all of the money earned? The legal team for the siblings would argue a resounding nay. They would argue that Jim Bob failed to pay his clients, acting more like an agent and manager than a protective father. Even worse, despite being legally responsible for their well-being, he allegedly placed them in a precarious financial situation, leaving them without any money when they reached maturity, even if they had earned millions of dollars. It's also critical to take into account any potential rebuttals from Jim Bob's legal group. They would most likely attempt to use familial and religious terminology to support their position. The possible defense of Jim Bob. The argument from the ministry. Never was this a job. It served as a ministry to spread our beliefs. The argument of the family provider. All 19 children received a home, food, and education thanks to the funds. The reasoning of the contract. The older children signed documents and consented to the arrangement. Let's take each of these apart, just like a plaintiff's attorney would. The argument from the ministry is the weakest. Whatever you call it, the law doesn't care. What it is matters to it. It was a business agreement with A&E Television Networks, a for-profit media company, and its subsidiary TLC. Advertisers paid for the show, brought in money. It wasn't a church service, it was a business. Calling it a ministry is not a legal defense. It is merely a conceptual one. Additionally, the family provider argument is quite weak. Legally, parents must give their minor children food, housing, and education. You are not entitled to the income your child receives in exchange for your basic parental responsibilities. The law does not operate that way. It's legally ridiculous, like stating, "I'm keeping your McDonald's paycheck because I bought you groceries this week." The most complicated argument is the contract argument. Indeed, TLC probably had the kids sign paperwork when they became 18. According to Jill's book, this caused a lot of stress and misunderstanding. She recounts being pressured to sign paperwork she didn't comprehend while being watched over by her father. These contracts were signed under duress or undue influence, according to a lawyer. More significantly, agreements made by minors are usually voidable, which means that when the child reaches adulthood, they have the option to terminate the agreement. Additionally, if the terms of any contract, even one signed by an adult, are judged to be unconscionable, that is, so blatantly unjust and biased that it shocks the conscience, they may be challenged in court. A contract in which a minor aged 18 who has no legal or financial advice signing over all their profits to their father in exchange for nothing could very well be judged unconscionable. The legal playbook is therefore obvious. Unjust enrichment would serve as the foundation for the case, which would also argue for fundamental unfairness and be strengthened by explosive charges of breaking the text, if not the spirit, of child labor regulations. Jim Bob would find it quite challenging to defend himself in a public court of law against this potent one-two punch. Jill's settlement demonstrates he's susceptible. Whether a case can be made is no longer the question. Rather, it is who has the guts to do it. The roster of the plaintiff. Who is entitled? Simply put, a legal theory is a theory. It requires a plaintiff, in this example a list of possible plaintiffs, to become a reality. Which of the other Duggar siblings can actually prove a case against their father? The short answer is almost all of them were extensively featured on the shows, but their claims and their willingness to file them vary greatly. To be precise, what we are going to perform is an analysis that is hypothetical. We are not reporting that any of these folks are actively launching a lawsuit right now. Because of their involvement with the Duggar television property, we are investigating their possible legal status. Any legal professional would do this when assessing the viability of a possible class action or multiple-faction case. We will not give their assertions artificial monetary values. It would be reckless and impossible. Rather, we will examine the elements that might decide the worth of their assertion. These elements include assessing the veracity of a claim, screen time, and the number of hours and episodes in which they appeared. Prominence and plot. Was their life, courtship, marriage, birth, years of labor, etc. a major story point? Both as adults and as minors, how many seasons did they work on the show? Advertising. Did they take part in TLC promotional events like photo shoots and interviews? We can create a list of the most likely litigants using these indicators, and we can evaluate the strength of their possible arguments. The first plaintiff profile is that of Jessa Seawald. Jessa Seawald is perhaps the most likely individual to be the focus of a new lawsuit. TLC changed its name and introduced Counting On after Josh's controversies in 2015 threatened to permanently ruin the family's TV career. The recently married Jessa and Jill provided the new episode with a fresh focus. The relationship between Jess and Ben Seawald, their marriage, and the arrival of Spurgeon, their first child, were the foundational Counting On stories. As far as the franchise was concerned, she was the new co-lead. The drama, the milestones, and the ratings came from her life. She wasn't merely a player. She was crucial to the success and continued existence of the show. The claim has a very high strength. Jess's contribution is simply recorded and indisputable. She became a key star in Counting On after working for years as a minor on 19 Children. A court would witness innumerable hours of video in which the audience is primarily being sold on her personal life. She would have a sizable claim for back pay, probably covering the whole tenure of Counting On until her frequent appearances ended. The obstacle was Jess's public character. Jessa has seemed to stay the most like her parents, Jim, Bob, and Michelle, out of all the married children. She and Ben seem to get along well with the family leadership and reside on property that Jim Bob gave them, making it. Filing a lawsuit would be like to declaring war on her father, endangering her familial ties, her house, and the entire social framework in which she was nurtured. That would be a huge decision that would change your life. For Jessa, the financial benefit can be viewed as outweighed by the personal burden. However, loyalty has its limitations, particularly when financial futures are involved, as we have seen with other families. Jinger Wolo is the second plaintiff profile. Jinger is an example of a distinct but no less potent kind of litigant. Jinger was frequently the show's most dynamic character, while Jessa served as its solid core. Her journey was a ratings booster, and fans dubbed her the rebel for her independence. Her romance with former professional soccer player Jeremy Vuolo was a significant plot point that increased the show's viewership. The show gained new settings and new stories when they relocated to Laredo, Texas, and later to Los Angeles, California. Jinger's transformation from a rural Arkansas Duggar kid to a chic, perhaps one of the most interesting character arcs in the history of the franchise, is that of the pastor's wife-in-law's very strong claim. Jinger, like Jessa, played a major role for several seasons. Her wedding was widely broadcast on television. Years of contentment came from her life with Jeremy and their kids. Her relocation to California is also an interesting legal twist. Her legal team can contend that because she resided and filmed in a state with strong protections for entertainers, such as the Coogan Law, she should, even if the main production firm was located somewhere else, been granted those protections. This can give rise to completely different legal arguments. The obstacle. Jeremy and Jinger have put a lot of effort into creating a brand that is distinct from the Duggars. They are well known on social media, have book deals, and a strong brand. They might believe that a lawsuit will force them to return to the family drama, from which they have apparently sought to distance themselves. But Jinger has also been speaking out more and more about letting go of the more rigid parts of her childhood. Indeed, as described in her book Becoming Free, this deconstruction process might easily lead to justice and financial freedom. A lawsuit might be presented as the last phase of her personal freedom, rather than as an assault. Her mental struggle between pursuing justice and moving on is what makes her such a strong candidate for a lawsuit. Joanna Forsythe is the third plaintiff profile. Perhaps more than anything else, Joanna's example emphasizes the child labor component of the possible lawsuit. More obvious than everyone else's. On film, we saw her develop from a little child to a teenager. In the later seasons of Counting On, her courtship with Austin Forsythe, their marriage, and their kids became a major plot point. Her argument would mostly center on the years she was legally unable to represent herself because a large portion of her on-screen work occurred while she was a minor. She was a young performer whose early years were televised for financial gain. However, it is said that she did not get any of the financial safeguards that other young actors are granted. Claim strength is high. The sheer number of years she spent on television as a child and a young adult makes her assertion noteworthy. She was a major performer at the time because of the extensive use of her courtship plot. The claim that she was a child laborer who was exploited is compelling both emotionally and visually. Any jury would wonder where Joanna's money went after watching footage of her working on the show at the ages of 12, 14, or 16. The obstacle. Just like Jessa, Joy, and Austin seems to have kept up a comparatively close contact with Michelle, Bob, and Jim. They work in the family's construction and real estate companies and reside in Arkansas. Their entire life and livelihood could be upended by a lawsuit. Austin would have to balance the possible multi-million-dollar judgment against the immediate disruption to their family and company affairs. Austin is renowned for his pragmatic and business-minded approach. It's as much a practical calculation as an sentimental one. Joseph and Josiah Duggar are the fifth and fourth plaintiffs. Despite having different personalities, we put the Duggar sons, Joseph and Josiah, together because their circumstances are comparable. In Counting On, their courtships and marriages to Lauren Swanson and Kendra Caldwell, respectively, are important story points. They weren't supporting roles. For several seasons, they were the male leads. Particularly from an early age, Josiah was a well-known figure, renowned for his cheeky and frank personality. It was suggested that Joseph's road to marriage and fatherhood was more conventional and stable. However, both of their stories were deemed necessary for the program. Claim strength is high. Their children's births and marriages were major TLC events, just like those of their sisters. They were filmed over their whole childhood and early adulthood. For them, the case for unjust enrichment is as compelling as it is for the daughters. It was the same work. The exploitation was no different. The obstacle. The sons encounter a distinct cultural obstacle. In the patriarchal society in which they grew up, Perhaps the greatest sin a guy can commit is to challenge the father figure. All of their lives they have been taught to follow Jim Bob's example, especially when it comes to business and money. Joseph plays a significant role in the family's real estate company. They would be openly opposing the patriarchal authority they have been taught to respect if they filed a lawsuit. It would need a severe psychological disconnection from their childhood. The plaintiffs who remained silent. There are more than these 5. Jeremiah, Jedediah, and John David. There is a possible claim for any child who has ever signed a contract, participated in an interview, or had their life narrative used to promote advertisements. Depending on screen time, the strength of each of their allegations may differ, but taken as a whole, their case would be overwhelming. The scope of the possible litigation becomes staggering when you put this list together. It wouldn't be one irate youngster, as Jim Bob may have attempted to explain the situation to Jill. 5, 6, or even more of his children would be putting up a united front and stating the same thing. We demand what we are due because we were taken advantage of and not paid. Such a body would have enormous legal authority. They might gather resources to work with the top legal firm. Together, their evidence would provide a vivid picture of institutionalized financial exploitation. Some people believe that Jim Bob Jara would have a terrible nightmare. Every day, observers are getting closer to reality. What is preventing them is the sole question. The one item they might be running out of time for could hold the answer to that. The precedents set by Jill Diller's lawsuit have been established. We have examined the compelling legal defenses of child labor violations and unjust enrichment. And we've put together the list of possible plaintiffs. A sibling group that, if banded together, could mount an enormous legal battle. However, this presents a crucial urgent query. Why hasn't it happened yet if the case is so compelling? Why the hesitancy? A legal idea that gives the whole situation a ticking clock could hold the key to the solution. The siblings' hands may be forced by an impending deadline. The drama shifts from if to when in this section of the narrative. Time is running out and the clock is ticking. There is a limit to justice in the legal system. The statute of limitations is the name given to it. This law establishes the upper limit of the amount of time that disputing parties have to start legal action. The goal is to guarantee that lawsuits are brought while the evidence is still new, and the recollections of witnesses are trustworthy. No matter how legitimate your claim is, a court may reject it after that window has closed. The silent clock on the wall, or the invisible enemy, is the statute of limitations for the Duggar siblings. The statute of limitations, the legal time bomb, and the multimillion-dollar question is determining when that clock runs out. In Arkansas, the legislation of Arkansas, where Mad Family Incorporated, the production firm behind Duggar, is headquartered and where the majority of the filming was done, must be examined in order to comprehend the urgency. The type of claim being made determines the time restriction. Let's think about the most probable reasons for action. First, a written contract was broken. The statute of limitations in Arkansas is 5 years if any of the adult children signed a contract with Jim Bob that called for payment they never received. The second is the violation of an oral agreement. This is more likely. The kids could contend that there was a verbal agreement that they would receive payment for their labor. In Arkansas, an oral contract has a much shorter statute of limitations, 3 years. Unfair enrichment comes in third and is the most potent. We talked about this earlier. It is founded on the fairness concept rather than a contract. The statute of limitations for a claim of unjust enrichment is likewise 3 years in Arkansas. 3 years. It sounds brief. Terrifyingly brief. Thus, the crucial query is, when does the clock begin to tick? The legal strategy becomes interesting at this point. The defense attorneys for Jim Bob would contend that the clock began to run as soon as the work was completed or, at the latest, when each child turned 18. The majority of the claims from their childhood or adolescence would have expired long ago if that were the true. However, the attorneys for the plaintiff would make the case for the discovery rule. One legal lifeline is the discovery rule. According to this, the statute of limitations doesn't start to run until the victim becomes aware that they have been harmed. It is unreasonable to expect you to file a lawsuit for an injury you were unaware you had. At what point did the Duggar siblings realize they were not getting paid for the money they owed? One might make a compelling case that they were brought up in a highly controlled environment throughout their lives, conditioning them to think the financial arrangement was appropriate, moral, and divine. They learned that it was wrong to ask for money. They didn't know the show's earnings, they didn't have access to the contracts, and they didn't know what the industry norms were. They were purposefully kept in the dark, so they couldn't have learned about the injuries. This is where the legal hotspot is created by Jill Dillard's case. A lawyer representing the other siblings might contend that it wasn't until Jill's suffering became well known throughout the family that everyone's clock started to tick. The moment the veil was lifted was when she filed her case. It was the moment of discovery. If Jill's settlement took place, say, in late 2020 or early 2001, the precise dates are unknown, then a 3-year statute of limitations would mean the window for filing a lawsuit could be closing at the end of 2023 or the beginning of 2024. This was the first time another sibling could look at the situation and say, wait, she was owed money? She had to sue to get it? That means I am owed money too. Right now we are there. For this reason, in recent months, there has been a greater amount of legal discourse surrounding this case. Before a legal door is permanently closed, the siblings can be in a race against time, having to make a choice that would shape the rest of their lives. Let's add another layer to this now. And this is where we start talking about exclusive hypotheses that are based on legal study and rumors from people who are familiar with these kinds of instances. Now, some legal experts are speculating about a stronger suit that would prolong this period. Deception or deceptive concealment. Exclusive theory. Dishonest concealment. The claim that Jim Bob, the defendant in this case, intentionally concealed the truth from the plaintiffs is known as fraudulent concealment. Not only were the children uninformed, it's because their ignorance was purposefully fostered. What proof would there be for this? First, the show was purportedly framed as a ministry instead than a business. This might be portrayed as a purposeful lie intended to repress inquiries pertaining to finances. The second is information control. The only one negotiating with TLC was Jim Bob. The budgets and contracts were only visible to him. According to reports, he never told his kids, the real performers, about this fact. This is a deliberate omission of important information. The third is the use of pressure. In her book, Jill talked about how she was forced to sign documents before she had had a chance to read or comprehend what they contained. This is a typical component in fraud and undue influence cases. If the siblings, attorneys could successfully claim that Jim Bob committed deceptive concealment because it accomplishes two goals. First of all, it significantly enhances the case by increasing the possibility of punitive penalties and additional funds being granted to penalize the defendant for heinous actions. Second, the statute of limitations may be tolled or paused in numerous jurisdictions. Until the fraud is found, the clock on a fraud claim does not start. Once more, Jill's case turns into a discovery event, but this time, the legal claim is far more serious. And thus we arrive at our initial insider report. Any competent law firm taking on this case would be looking at the fraud angle first and foremost. A legal source who has been following this case for years and specializes in entertainment law in the southern United States told channels like this one. This source states, and I quote, "The fraud claim is the one that penalizes the offender, whereas the unjust enrichment claim gets you the money back. It's the difference between asking for your wallet back and pressing charges for the mugging." A jury would be very open to a fraud argument given the family dynamics and the alleged spiritual manipulation, which implies that the siblings' legal team, if one is being assembled, isn't just exploring a wage dispute but maybe constructing a case alleging a 10-year scheme to defraud their own children. This urgency may account for some of the recent subtle changes we've observed. Jinger's book, while focused on Jill's book, is the financial Rosetta Stone, translating the family's spiritual principles into a story of financial control. Spiritual deconstruction lays the foundation by describing the high control environment she grew up in. These are not just memoirs, they are public testimonies. They are the initial drafts of a legal complaint. The clock is ticking, the pressure is mounting, and the siblings must decide whether to set off a legal bomb that could. The nuclear option and the devastating fallout of a lawsuit of this size would be more than just a financial transaction. It would be a cataclysmic event for the Duggar family. We call it the nuclear option because the fallout would be widespread, devastating, and irreversible, impacting their finances, their reputation, and the very structure of their family. This would destroy the family's financial security and public image forever. Fallout Zone 1: The Financial Purge. Let's examine the three layers of this potential destruction: the financial purge, the reputational collapse, and the kingdom crumbles. First, the money. A ruling in favor of even 5 or 6 of the siblings could easily amount to tens of millions of dollars. According to a 2020 Daily Mail article citing family sources, the Duggars' net worth was estimated to be around $3.5 million, but this figure is generally thought to be a dramatic underestimate. It probably doesn't take into consideration the enormous amount of commercial and residential real estate that Jim Bob has accumulated over the years, which some Arkansas real estate insiders estimate could be worth well over $10 million, if not more. In the event of a lawsuit, a process known as discovery would begin, which is a defendant's worst nightmare. Jim Bob would be legally required to produce all of the financial records pertaining to the family business under penalty of perjury. Mad Family Incorporated tax returns, years of corporate tax returns that expose the show's actual income, personal tax returns, Jim, Bob, and Michelle's personal filings, bank statements, corporate and personal accounts that showed where the money went, property deeds and ledgers, a complete accounting of every property purchased and sold, internal communications, emails, and texts between Jim Bob and TLC, contract, every amendment, displaying the precise payment schedule and amounts. For 19 children and counting on. Executives. The secrecy that has surrounded the Duggar family's finances for decades would be destroyed, and for the first time, the full extent of the company would be exposed in a court of law. Here is another exclusive theory that has been making the rounds among financial analysts who follow the family. Jim Bob has been systematically shifting assets into a complicated web of LLCs and trusts, possibly to protect them from future court rulings. Used by the wealthy, but the discovery process of a lawsuit is meant to break through these barriers. The plaintiff's forensic accountants would track every dollar from the time it left TLC's bank account to its ultimate destination, whether it was an offshore account, a piece of land, or a used car lot. If a judgment is granted, Jim Bob couldn't simply say, "I don't have the cash." The court can place liens on assets, which are legal claims against property that can be. This lawsuit isn't just about getting a check. It's about a court-ordered dismantling of a financial institution. Imagine signs for sale going up in front of the Duggar family's commercial properties, the fleet of black Suburbans being towed to an auction lot, and the ultimate symbol of their empire, the massive family home in Tantytown, being appraised for liquidation. If he still refused to pay, a judge could order the seizure and sale of those assets. A successful lawsuit would be a legal stamp of invalidation on that entire narrative. For 20 years, the Duggar brand has been built on a carefully crafted image of wholesome Christian family values, where they were presented as a model of patriarchal authority, working in perfect harmony with submissive children, all united in their faith. Fallout Zone 2: the reputational collapse. The financial blow would be massive, but the damage to their reputation might be even worse. The public testimony would be agonizing. Imagine Jessa SeaWorld testifying under oath about how her father refused to pay her for broadcasting the birth of her own son. Imagine Jinger testifying about being used as a reality TV star while living as a missionary, unable to afford basic necessities without fundraising. Imagine Joseph and Josiah explaining how they were forced to work for the family business for free. The law would formally declare that the patriarch exploited his children for profit. Even as adults, every news report would frame it as a story of greed and control concealed behind a facade of faith, and every headline would read, "Duggar children win lawsuit proving financial exploitation by father." This leads us to another insider report. As a source who has worked in public relations for faith-based personalities, has suggested that such a verdict would make the Duggars radioactive in the conservative Christian world they once dominated. It is a brand apocalypse. Their ministry would be exposed as a business, their family structure would be exposed as a system of exploitation, and it would be the ultimate betrayal of the public. This source claims that the Josh Duggar scandal was about a single bad apple son. The family could isolate and condemn his actions, but a lawsuit from the good kids, the obedient ones, makes the entire system the problem. It shows the parents. The Duggar family contract has never been a legal one. It has always been based on faith, obedience, and the unwritten rule that father knows best. A lawsuit replaces that covenant with subpoenas and depositions, forcing siblings to choose sides. Who would testify for Jim Bob? Who would support the plaintiffs? The family would be torn apart in a public forum. Fallout Zone 3. The kingdom crumbles. Lastly, the lawsuit would destroy the family itself. Reconciliation would no longer exist. We also need to think about the effect on Michelle Dar, who has mostly kept quiet during every incident. The soft-spoken matriarch in a lawsuit, she would be deposed and asked under oath, "Mrs. Did you realize, Duggar, that your kids were the main cast members of a television program worth millions of dollars? Were you aware that they weren't getting paid? Have you ever supported them? Why not?" Her responses or lack thereof would be disastrous. This is the part of it that is actually nuclear. Takes more than simply cash or prestige. It destroys the fundamental bonds within the family. And for the siblings, this is perhaps the biggest impediment. Regardless of what they owe, can they bring themselves to treat their own parents in this way? This leads us to the last terrifying insider report, which has been more popular in the Duggar viewing community in recent weeks. A tip from an unnamed internet source asserting that reveal that some of the siblings have already participated in an initial legal consultation, since they have a relationship to a former production assistant. This story claims that at least 3 of the siblings met together with a financial lawsuit legal company located in Arkansas. The goal of the conference was to learn about their rights, the strength of their case, and most importantly, the statute of limitations, rather than to launch a lawsuit right away. According to this account, the consultation took place in the latter part of the summer. In 2023. To be clear, it is a rumor, but it is a rumor that is entirely consistent with the time frame. It is consistent with the statute of limitations urgency. It explains why family members like Jill and Jinger are becoming more confident in expressing their opinions. It implies that the siblings aren't only waiting aimlessly, they are getting ready for a possible conflict, analyzing their choices and gathering information. The nuclear option is no longer merely a hypothetical possibility if this report is accurate. The beginning. There are codes on the table. In the Duggar family saga, which started as a televised curiosity and may culminate in a sour public and legally mandated reckoning, the siblings are considering a move that would be the last decisive chapter. The reckoning. A very human tragedy emerges when you take away the reality TV cameras, the legalese, and the financial speculation. One strong tenet, a covenant of faith and obedience, formed the basis of the Duggar family's tale. The kids were instructed that respecting their parents equated to respecting God. Like everything else, financial problems were to be left to Jim Bob, the patriarch and leader of the household. Instead of requiring legal justice, the system required complete trust. That foundation held for decades. With the scandals, the lies, and the gradual awakening of children who grew up and started to view the world and their own family differently, it started to fall apart. Suing Jill Dillard was more than just a court case. That foundation had a fracture caused by a seismic incident. She showed that secular legal principles could be more just than the values they were taught growing up, and that the family's covenant could be contested. The family is now confronted with the most terrifying scenario of all. Perhaps neither a media inquiry nor an independent prosecutor will deliver the last death blow to the Duggar empire. It might originate from the very kids who have been the quietest and externally devoted. The mainstays of the family, Jinger, Joy, Anna, Joseph, Josiah, and Jessa, were the ones that carried the load following Josh's downfall. The last retribution is their possible lawsuit. It is the ultimate test of the family's foundation, contrasting their upbringing in the values of obedience and forgiveness with their yearning for justice and financial independence. A court triumph would be more than just a monetary award. It would be ethical. It would be the most amazing thing ever. Confirmation of the long-standing claims made by numerous detractors, that a system of exploitation and control existed behind the healthy exterior. Jim Bob Duggar's empire was never a stronghold of religion. The foundation of this house of cards was unpaid labor and blind devotion. And now it may all fall apart with the slightest breeze from a courthouse door. The next legal battle is on the horizon, and the family themselves will be the victims this time. We have discussed the legal precedents, possible claims, the time limit, and the terrible outcomes. We'd like to hear from you now. Would you file a lawsuit for your underpaid wages if you were one of the other Duggar siblings? Why not? Is the possibility of your family's disintegration worth pursuing financial justice? Is it an unforgivable betrayal or a just demand for what is due? Please share your opinions in the comments section below. Your viewpoint contributes significantly to this continuing discussion. We appreciate your participation in the Duggar Report. If you thought this inquiry was enlightening, to ensure you don't miss our next in-depth discussion, kindly hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. Stay informed until the next time.